Welcome to another Redwall video analysis review thingamajiggery thing, where today we are talking the 9th book in the series, The Pearls of Lutra. This is a book I would call the gateway between the classic and less classic eras of Redwall stories. So we say it time and time again, Redwall books, like my reviews, are often accused of being repetitive. And while that's certainly true, I found over the course of this reread that there is very least nuance to this conversation on exactly how repetitive Redwall books are. And especially as I advocate in all of these videos, you really have to read these books in the order they were published and not in the order they chronologically take place in the universe, as these Red Fox books so foolishly tell you to do. So why do I say that? Well, when you read the books in publishing order, you notice the author, Brian Jacques' growth. He takes the same motifs and he writes them a little differently and sometimes a little better. And when it comes to Pearls, I once again found that reading in publishing order was particularly important. Here's a thing that's almost more kvetchy than central to the book. But as a kid, I read these books in chronological order because that was the order that was advertised on the edition of the Redwall books that I bought. So as such, I read the book Redwall, 7th or 8th, and I followed that up with Matameo. Now, Matameo was a real joy to read because it was about the son of the main character from Redwall. As such, all of the old characters were back, plus we got to meet this newer, younger generation. It was a great thrill in a series that, regularly jumps between generations to finally take some time with a cast of characters and gradually evolve on from them by progressing the series one generation forward. So when I heard that the next book, Pearls of Lutra, was going to be about Matameo's son, Martin II, I got excited because I figured we were getting another sequel that's only a little bit in the future. Finally, it seemed Brian Jacques wasn't doing that thing that I hated so much as a kid, where he wrote about entirely new characters each time. He was finally figuring out that what we wanted to read was a series. But little me ended up being disappointed. Because for some reason, even though Matameo was just a child in the previous chronological book, The Pearls of Lutra is somehow set not only after the death of Matthias, but after the death of Matameo. And as I reread this book, I do notice that Matameo's son, Martin II, reads as very mature, so it could make sense that he's in his 40s or even his 50s. But still, dangling the promise of a sequel, a book about Martin II, surely Brian Jacques realized readers would expect all the characters, or at least the younger characters, from Matameo to be back. Why, Brian? Why? But I found reading the books in publishing order kind of kills that disappointment a little. Because rather than reading in the order of Redwall, Matameo, Pearls of Lutra, I read The Bellmaker 7th, then Outcast of Redwall, and then Pearls of Lutra. And if you read those three books together, you kind of start to see a pattern that Brian Jacques, even though sometimes he forces himself to, really doesn't like to write sequels. So let me explain. The Bellmaker, the first of those three books, actually is a sequel. It continues the adventures of the heroes Mariel and Dandin from Mariel of Redwall. However, I found when reading it as an adult, it's a real mess of a book in which Brian crams in a ton of characters, meaning most of the individual characters in that book end up really underdeveloped and you almost forget they're there. Dandin in particular. To me, it seemed like with the Bellmaker that what happened is someone told Brian, maybe a trusted advisor, maybe even a publisher, that his fans would really like another sequel. And he was like, but ma'am, I want to write a book about this new character, Finbar Galedeep, the cool otter, instead. And his publisher was like, Brian, you are going to write the book about Mariel and Dandin, whether you want to or not. And Brian was like, fine. And so he pretended to write a book about Mariel and Dandin while really writing a book about Finbar Galedeep. And as such, he wrote a hot mess with too many characters where it seemed to have one vision, but then Brian kind of snuck in another. With his next two books, however, Outcast of Redwall and The Pearls of Lutra, Brian Jacques decided to write a kind of sequel he was more comfortable with. He wrote books set in the distant future after a previous book, maybe about 50 seasons, so that they could nominally be thought of as sequels because there'd be a few throwback references. There'd still be memories of characters from the last book. A few of the characters might still be lingering around, but for the most part, he'd get to write with that blank slate that he prefers. So in Outcast of Redwall, he included Bella the Badger from Mossflower, but killed off pretty much everyone else. Similarly, in Pearls of Lutra, he kept Alma the Badger around because he's now established that badgers live a long time, and Rollo the Vole, because Rollo was a baby in the last book. So he decided, okay, Rollo can still be around as an old man, but everyone who's slightly older than Rollo has died of old age. That said, he does include a number of references to the presumably dead characters from the last book, including Ambrose Spike, Jubilation Stump, and Tim and Tess Churchmouse. You know, it made me think of the South Park Member Berries episode. Member Tim Churchmouse? I member. And that all said, I also think there's a specific reason why Brian Jacques might have chosen to kill off Madameo rather than bring him back as a middle-aged or elderly character. And that's because a key component of Madameo's personality was that he was a child. His character arc was literally growing up and learning to be patient with others. So who would Madameo even be as an adult? Now, I and a lot of other fans might have theories about what an older Madameo would have looked like. But here again, we come to Brian Jacques really liking repetitiveness. And though he had the talent to maybe write an older Madameo, it wouldn't fit with his style. What I've noticed throughout the series is that Brian does have a lot of creative ideas where if he wanted to, he could take the series in different directions, but he sticks to a number of strict rules. And whenever his characters start to deviate from those rules, he really reins them in. So could he have written a grown-up, but still sometimes arrogant and immature Madameo character? Yes, but I feel like one of Brian Jacques' rules is that for the most part, good guy warriors, if they're adults, have to be good examples to the young one. So it just didn't make sense to write an adult Madameo. Instead, he started fresh with Martin II, and he didn't have to have any of those problems. Finally, on top of that, I have to say that back when Brian Jacques wrote Madameo in 1988, I can't imagine he ever seriously considered writing a sequel to it about Martin II. I assume when he ended Madameo by saying that Madameo had a baby named Martin II, hearkening back to the ancient hero of Redwall, Martin I, he was saying, my series has come full circle, Madameo is the end. So it seems like with Pearls of Lutra is when it dawned on him, this might be a forever series. I can't keep on cramming everything between the lifetimes of Martin I and Madameo. Gonna have to start dipping into the future. And for what it's worth, Martin II is a perfectly likable, if not particularly special hero. Now that I've rambled on about how frustrating it is that Pearls of Lutra wasn't really a sequel to Madameo, let's finally talk about what this book is about. So another of my theories that nuances Brian Jacques' relationship to repetitiveness is the idea that his later books were an attempt to rewrite and improve on his earlier books. Mariel of Redwall I viewed as a rewrite of Redwall. The Bellmaker was sort of a rewrite of Madameo. Outcast of Redwall, at least in terms of the villain plot, was a rewrite of Salamandastron. And now we have our first rewrite of a rewrite, as I kind of view Pearls of Lutra as a rewrite of Mariel of Redwall. Firstly, its main villain, Ublas, lives on an isolated island where he's essentially king of the pirates. Secondly, one of the main heroines, Graf the Otter, is an orphan set on violently avenging her family's death. Thirdly, we once again get a trio of Dibbins. Dibbins is the Redwall word for preschoolers who fancy themselves warriors. Fourthly, the main villain has a venomous pet. And finally, though this is a pattern in the series more broadly, Ublas isn't actually that focused on attacking the heroes, but rather on fighting his rival bad guy. This one happens to be a fox named Riskanza. Now, when Riskanza showed up, I kind of rolled my eyes. And that's because once again, it felt like Brian Jacques had a great idea and he was like, no, this is too risky. Let's do something that's safer within my formula. So earlier in this book, Ublas was seemingly going to be involved in a different kind of bad guy civil war. There was this pirate stoat named Baranka who was angry that Ublas had imprisoned and killed his brother Kanva. He had also grown tired of Ublas reaping all the wealth from the pirates' hard work while he sat up being fancy in his castle. So Baranka and the other pirates organized a revolution. It seemed like Brian Jacques was finally abandoning the idea that piracy was simply a flavor of evil. He was acknowledging the more nuanced history that while pirates certainly had to do some unfortunate things as part of their jobs, piracy was also, in theory, a path out of poverty. And at least within pirate society, there was some element of democratic and even socialistic values. So if Brian had actually kept the Barranca versus Ublas conflict in his book, this book might have actually felt like an upgrade. It would have actually engaged with more moral grayness than the series had engaged with before. But as always happens when Brian's stories get too risky and rebellious, he reined them in and just had this more generic bad guy fox named Versconza come in, kill Barranca, and start a more generic conflict with Ublas. I think a big part of the appeal of Pearls of Lutra is that it offers a different aesthetic from earlier books in the series. So Ublas's island is described as somewhere far away, vaguely tropical, perhaps. It's inhabited by evil monitor lizards. We also meet a colony of seals along the way who speak their own language. Ublas himself, meanwhile, is seemingly the first villain with superpowers. He has hypnotic eyes. He also has the potential to be more of a campy, I guess a queer-coded villain than other villains we've seen in the series, as his motive is he wants these 6 pearls that were stolen from the otters and then lost to go into his crown. But sadly, Ublas does not get a particularly unique voice. Most of the time when you're reading an Ublas scene, he just reads as a generic Redwall villain. His fashion-obsessed side or his magic-obsessed side don't play out most of the time. Most of the time, he's just another gruff-speaking baddie who wants to kill all the other baddies. As for the heroes in this book, as is often the case, they're split between different subplots. So on the one hand, as you can see on the front of this book, we have an adventuring party featuring Martin II, Graf the Otter, who I've already talked about, and a hare named Klecky, who, like all the other hares in the book, is a gluttonous goofball who speaks with a posh accent. At first, I didn't really care for Klecky. I'm like, Brian, I can't care this much about this character. He's the same character we've seen a million times. You've just given him a different name because you forced yourself to write into a different generation. Like, I'd rather he just gave, like, Basil Staghare's grandson a cameo than creating another hare and pretending he was different. But I guess Klecky did kind of grow on me by the end of the book because if nothing else, the hares are genuinely funny. And there were times where it seemed like Klecky's silly side was actually an obstacle to the Krupies. You know, with Basil, he was always obviously hyper competent, even though he was also silly. Whereas with Klecky, at times you wondered, is he too much of a goofball to be a good warrior? Now, as for the other heroes, at Redwall Abbey, we have a young hedgehog named Tansy, who along with the elderly Rollo, a mouse named Hicknim, and a squirrel named Cracklin, discovers that 6 pearls are hidden at the Abbey. As for these main characters, I thought they were fine, I guess. In the case of Rollo, I feel again, Brian is kind of relying on freebie nostalgia. Remember Rollo? You liked him back in Matameo, without actually making the effort to show that this is the same character from Matameo. This is what this troublesome baby looked like as an adult. No, Rollo's just kind of a generic Redwall adult. Hicknim and Cracklin are kind of pointless. You know, Brian Jacques likes to have his characters in big groups, even if that means throwing around names that don't get unique personalities. That said, he does end up doing something quite dramatic with Hicknim eventually. Tansy is fine as a main character. I thought she was great at the beginning of the book when she was in direct conflict with another character who ends up being quite important, a prissy vole named Viola. Brian actually surprised me by making Viola a main character in her own right. He was kind of revisiting another character, possibly her mother or grandmother, Cynthia Bankvole from an earlier book. But I think both she and Tansy would have been even better if they were actually together and constantly put up against each other. You know, Tansy is the more straightforwardly likable goody two-shoes, where Viola is a bit spoiled and a bit more scared. But unfortunately, they sort of go their own ways, and as such, they kind of morph into generic good guys rather than having their flaws pitted against each other. But, you know, I was happy that Viola did get as much page time as she did. So at the beginning of this video, I called this book the gateway between the classic and less classic Redwall books. And there are a couple moments in this book where it feels like Brian Jacques, you know, really revisits elements of his past writing and has fun exploring what has changed about the series. So while searching for the pearls, for instance, Tansy and her friend learn that Firmald, the squirrel who had hid pearls in the first place, hid one of them in the Abbey Pond, where in the past she had desperately tried to catch a fish. In old age, she'd seemingly come to see that fish as more of an old friend than something she wanted to eat. And this is interesting because in the very first Redwall book, fishing is an important motif. Brian Jacques said that he just saw Matthias catching a fish for the Redwall feast as a way of giving Matthias his first battle to fight while keeping it relatively low stakes. But after the first couple books, Brian Jacques certainly continues to maintain references to characters eating seafood, and it's mostly seafaring characters like otters. I'm pretty sure he intentionally phased out the idea of good characters actively hunting for their food. I can't be 100% sure of Brian Jacques' motives because it's such a subtle change, but to me, it was a meaningful change. I'm able to enjoy the other books a lot more than the first few books, even though the first few books were otherwise really good, because I find fishing scenes upsetting. And it was a nice little change. And I feel like there was a wink to it in this book where Brian Jacques was like, yes, fishing was part of my lore, but we've kind of moved on from that. And now fish are closer to being friend characters, even if they aren't quite personified. A less subtle rejection of the past comes in the handling of St. Ninian's Church, a building adjacent to Redwall that for some reason in this book is simply referred to as Ninians. Somehow between the events of Madame Mayo and the Pearls of Lutra, the saint has been lost to time. So St. Ninians was most prominent in the first Redwall book. And that's because that book was written as a draft and sent to a publisher by a friend of Brian Jacques's without him even knowing it. And as such, it contains a number of elements that in his more polished books, he decided not to reference. So generally, the Redwall books are set in a universe where, as far as we know, humans don't exist, whereas the very first Redwall book was written more in the shadows of a human society. So there were various weird details, whether it was rats riding on horses, the characters eating goat's cheese, one of the characters potentially being from Portugal, and finally this idea of a church and there being saints. In the subsequent books, while Redwall is set in an abbey, Brian Jacques makes very clear that abbey is just a type of building, and even though he uses the language of abbey and abbot and abbess and brother and sister, these books are very much not Christian. If the characters have a religion at all, it's just the religion of kindness and the religion of harmony with nature. In that first book, however, it was a bit more ambiguous whether the characters were actually Christian, and as such, you have this church called St. Ninian's. And that clearly became awkward for Brian Jacques. So finally, he decides with Pearls of Lutra, he's going to tear off the Band-Aid and say, why the F is there a saint in one of my books? So I'm just going to have the word saint be so meaningless that it's lost to time. And somehow by this generation, we only call the building Ninians. And then, spoiler alert, Ninians ends up being burned down to the ground by the characters of Redwall Abbey. And this happens after, spoiler alert, Picnim is killed by an army of jackdaws who live at Ninian. Rollo, who's a respected elder, calls for Ninians to be burned down after this because it simply has too many traumatic memories associated with it, as it was used historically as a base for a number of villains, including Clooney the Scourge and Slagar the Cruel. Now, the tragedy of this is that Ninians, of course, had good historic value. In modern society, it would surely be preserved as a heritage building. And even for Redwall, it had some positive associations. It was the home of Gomph and Columbine, or it was the home of John Churchmouse and children Tess and Tim. But I guess Rollo's dramatic decision tells us two things. One, in the real world, it is sometimes easy to lose sight of all those who have done good in the name of Christianity or the beauty of churches because of Christianity's many crimes and the right-wing politics that's associated with. And two, within Redwall history, records are kind of poorly kept. There was not much memory of all the time and the heroes who came between Martin and Matthias. So the idea of preserving heritage buildings clearly doesn't occur to them. The irreverence for the past shown by the burning of St. Ninian's is why this book serves as a gateway for Redwall's future. This book kind of freed up Brian Jacques to do what he liked, which was write about new characters, tell new stories every time. And, I'm not sure if that's a good choice because that very much lends itself to repetitiveness, but I appreciated the boldness, the drama of that gesture of burning down the church. There's a lot to talk about in this book, and I'm going to post a separate video that is a character study of the character of Romska, who I have criminally not mentioned at all in this video. But I've gone long enough, so let me know your thoughts about the Pearls of Lutra in the comments below, and see you next time.